Hello, wonderful AP Gov people. This is our supplement to the AP videos for 4.5 and 4.6. Once again, they in no way replace the 4.5 and 4.6 videos. They're just a supplement to them. Let's be honest, those two sections are pretty dry, right? Pretty dry. So I try to bring some extra information, some relevant stuff to the content. So for 4.5, they first explained three different types of polls: benchmark polls, tracking polls, and entrance and exit polls. So the two sets of text on the right are actually screenshots from Ballotpedia. And I thought this was good additional information because the AP videos are pretty short. So if you read along, it says campaigns do not use polls the same way that public opinion firms do. Rather than attempt to understand the way a race stands, campaigns use benchmark polls and focus groups to find the most resonant messages and the best language with which to relay those messages. So, teachers use benchmarks all the time. So you've probably heard that phrase, like during a project, there might be certain benchmarks you have to make. So the same way here, along the campaign, there's certain stops to see, where do we stand, right? So public polling companies conduct polls. These are tracking polls to see who is ahead and who is behind, as well as by how much. So right off the bat, you're like, tracking polls are pretty similar to tracking. Tracking polls and benchmark polls are similar. Campaigns also conduct these polls, but rely more heavily on polling and focus groups geared towards messaging, and they call this benchmark polling. So you see just an example here of from the most recent election, who's ahead. So by different dates, right, there's different benchmarks along the way to see where they stand, or tracking polls. All right. And I want to give you some examples, and these ones are these polls just by different points of their platform, right? Different issues. So share of Biden voters and Trump voters who said the following issues were very important deciding who to vote for. So controlling the spread of 19, that was COVID-19, that was extremely important to Biden voters. Still more than half for Trump voters as well. Like, what was the most important things for Trump voters? You see protecting from terrorism, economic recovery. Um, then you look at things like building a border wall, which was only 7% for Biden, but 52% for Trump, right? So these issues are all these kind of polls the campaigns always use to as they structure where they're going to go next. Okay, now the teacher in the video explained how different events usually cause increase in approval ratings or decreases, right? A good economy usually causes an increase. Handling a war or a crisis would normally cause an increase, right? But a bad economy or a scandal or a poorly handled crisis or war usually causes a decrease. And they put out the exception that the Clinton scandal actually helped his approval rating. You see here this example from this poll that how the coronavirus response affected Trump's approval rating, right? So by February, you had a low, right? You get high again. How do people were disapproved? 54% in September goes up, right? So that was something that would have hurt his approval rating. What about the riots that we saw, right? These AP videos were all made well before these issues happened. So you look at all voters, but then Democrats, how it hurt Trump's approval rating, independents, even Republicans to some degree. Okay. Now, just because a poll is taken does not mean it is perfect, does not mean all that data is evaluated the way it should. You have lots of different issues. One is loaded language, right? The words that are used in these questions make a difference. So this is an example. This is an article from NPR. You can look this up if you wish, about how language shapes the gun debate. So the way you use questions, the way you word things, make a difference. So the NRA does not use its opponent's phrase violent prevention. For us, it's gun rights. So you see, the different spin you use is important to the language. Most people think that words just refer to things in the world. Most people don't understand that's played for this, and that it's neutral, right? No polls usually, I shouldn't say no, but polls are often not neutral. Speaking of gun rights, if you saw Representative Beaubert's clip that went sort of viral this week, she called carrying her gun her personal security detail, right? It wasn't her gun, it was her personal security detail. Language, loaded language, that makes a difference. Okay. Also, the order of questions and how you phrase a question makes a difference. Pew Research, if you want to go to this article, it even says that if you have certain questions and then an open-ended question, the open-ended question is going to take information from the previous questions they were asked. Right? So if you read along here, an example of a wording difference that had a significant impact on responses came from a January 2003 survey. People asked whether they would favor or oppose taking military action in Iraq to end Saddam Hussein's rule. 68% said they would favor this action. 25% said they opposed. But if you change the wording to would they favor or oppose taking military action in Iraq to end Saddam Hussein's rule, even if that meant that U.S. forces might suffer thousands of casualties, notice that in italics is added, then the responses were different. It went from 68% down to 43%. And opposing it went from 25% to 48%, right? So once again, the phrasing of questions makes a difference. And I mentioned the order of questions, like if there's an open-ended after multiple choice. If you read along here, this is also from Pew Research. Another experiment embedded in December 2008 poll resulted in a contrast effect. When people were asked, all in all, are you satisfied or dissatisfied with the way things are going in the country, right? Immediately after you were asked, do you approve or disapprove the way George Bush is handling his job as president, 88% they were dissatisfied, right? But if you didn't ask that question first, you have different answers. Okay, so a similar finding occurred in December 2004 when both satisfaction and presidential approval were higher, right? So sort of tying these ideas together makes a difference in how people respond, right? That kind of read through that again. That's good sort of prep for possible examples you can get. Then we have the Bradley effect. This comes from Ballotpedia. They went over what that is in the video, right? It had to do with Bradley, who was running for governor, I think in Virginia years ago, right? So sometimes people don't answer in a poll the way they honestly will vote. So adherents of the Bradley effect believe that some voters will tell posters that they are undecided or likely to vote for a minority candidate. They don't want to seem like they're discriminatory. So during the poll, they're like, oh yeah, I would vote for this person. But in reality, they might not. If you read more about the Bradley effect, it does expand beyond race. There have been concerns over the years that people do this for female candidates, that they say they won't vote for them. So it's sort of the opposite, but in reality, they would. So less women were being elected into office because of that. Those preliminary polls meant they weren't being put up to represent their party in the first place, right? So people not always answering honestly does make a difference. Right, then we have framing issues, how questions are framed. And this comes from Gallup polls. So notice that there's two different questions here. So, but it's the same content, but it's the way they're framed. So the first one, which was done by ABC and the Washington Post, all in all, considering the cost to the U.S. versus the benefits to the U.S., do you think the war with Iraq was worth fighting or not? So their results is that 46% said it was, 53% said it wasn't. All right. Then the CNN USA Gallup poll, in view of the development since we first sent our troops to Iraq, do you think the U.S. made a mistake in sending troops to Iraq or not? Very similar, right? Read below. Even more surprising is the congruence in results based on two different ways of asking how the war in Iraq is going. Right, and said the difference, but then it says here below, the ABC poll found 37% who said the U.S. was making progress, not much different from the 34% in the Gallup survey, setting the U.S. and its allies. Either result suggests that most people have a dim view of how things are going in Iraq. So because of, they said, all in all, considering the costs, right? Words like that frame how people are going to respond. Now we also have push polls, and this comes from the New York Times. And push polls are not really even considered polls. These are things your family might get certain calls for. It's basically a campaign conducting a poll, but their questions are sort of to try to get you to think a certain way, right? Notice it reads that they're often criticized as a particularly sleazy form of negative political campaigning. Voters pick up a phone to hear what sounds like a research poll, but it's not to collect information, which literal polls are to collect information. This is more to share information. The questions are skewed to one side of an issue or candidate, the goal being to sway large numbers of voters under the guise of survey research. But the fact that a poll contains questions with negative information about one or more candidates does not make it a push poll, right? Campaigns regularly conduct genuine surveys, right? They do, that test campaign messages and advertising. So it's to sort of gather their own information for a campaign, but on how they should do this. And it shows you how push polling, like how all these different groups have actually denounced push polls. Okay, two other issues is opinion saliency. If you're so set on one or poll results that you're sort of skewed on all the other results because you're so focused on one issue, or maybe you're just uninformed of an issue, right? You're answering a question on Iraq, but you haven't really been following the news on the war in Iraq. That doesn't make the poll then accurate. Okay, so then it talks about different types of scientific polling. Go through that again if you haven't. It's pretty self-explanatory. What a random sample is versus stratified sample versus a representative sample. Right, 4.6. I think this is even drier than 4.5, but the video does explain it a little bit better. A lot of these are literally just screenshots from the AP video, so I don't need to be repetitive. But public opinion, how do you get public opinion? By entrance and exit polls, by tracking polls, and by benchmark polls. We've already discussed those. And then scientific polls feature various facets such as representative samples, which was in the last slide there, random samples in the last slide, and they usually have a lower margin of error, plus or minus 3%. Okay, the purpose, right? Why do these exist? To take the pulse. How are people feeling? Elected officials use them to just figure out what should they be doing right then, right? How do they evaluate their support from their people? And how do they word things, right? Based on what the people like or dislike. And they find 3 different patterns. Once again, this is literally just a screenshot from the AP video, right? One of the single most effective predictors of public opinion is an individual's party identification. So if you want to know how some person feels on an event, if you want to know how someone feels on climate change or gun control or combating terrorism, knowing if they're Republican or Democrat is the first major predictor on how they will feel. The second major factor is their gender, and their third would be their race. Now, that does not mean that every person votes according to or feels the way an issue is based on their party or gender or race, but as a whole, right? You can sway those categories. So this is from the Oxford Bibliography, and this gives you examples on gender differences in issues. So regardless if someone's a Republican or Democrat or any other party, often their gender is the biggest factor to see how they would lay, right? So here you see some examples. Women tend to be less supportive of the use of force, either internationally or domestically, right? So there's a big consistent group in the use of force. So that's one. There's also a gender gap in the death penalty. Women are more supportive than men of government spending on social welfare programs, right? There's another difference. There's a gender gap in support for government spending on food stamps and welfare. Women are also more likely to believe in climate change and to be concerned about the negative effects of climate change. It goes on to give other examples, right? Equal rights of historically marginalized groups, including African Americans, women, and the LGBTQ community. Women are more likely than men to support equal gender roles, to support gay rights, to report less resentful racial attitudes towards African Americans, and other morality issues. Women are less supportive of marijuana legalization and more supportive of school prayer. So regardless of their party. So that's something politicians keep in mind when they know what audience they're trying to appeal to at any time. Then, as I mentioned before, race is an also factor. So this is an example from Pew Research of just the racial view of things in post-Hurricane Katrina, right? So it gives you an example. There's a poll here, right? Did Hurricane Katrina show that racial equality is still a problem? 71% of Black respondents said yes, as opposed to 32% of whites, right? So significant, right? So this is once again another screenshot. What do these patterns do, right? So you can assume, and you'll see questions like this, and the multiple choice questions. They'll be like, if someone was a Democrat, how would they most likely respond to climate change, right? Republican and national defense spending, right? What about the gender gap? What about racial differences? So you want to be familiar with, go back through those issues, which ones are more likely to vote of whether you're Republican or Democrat, and you probably know most of them already. All right, there's critics to these kind of polls and these kind of collection of data. They're not always accurate. Polls can be wrong. Respondents, since they do respond to the way things are worded or phrased or ordered, therefore might not be accurate. And the public can just be wrong. They might not just not know things. Okay, now it's the next part said how all three branches are affected by this, right? Why are these polls? Why is this data important to legislators, right? Legislators are responsive to polls. They want to keep their constituents satisfied in hopes of getting reelected. So the big news for this past week that we discussed was not only the disaster in Texas, but how Ted Cruz responded to it, or his lack of response. Now, in the news today is how he's helping out and he's like helping feed firefighters, but we know about the little trip to Cancun, right? So this actually shows a result. How important, if at all, is it for political representatives to be in their home state during an emergency? Now, if this was questioned right after this event is going to affect people's polls. If this was asked a month ago, maybe not. Because here, over 55% said it was important, right? Also, the executive branch, the president can use the bully pulpit to respond to public opinion. Presidential approval rating measures general public opinion. Now we know Trump used Twitter as a big form of his bully pulpit, and even his tweets showed how much polls mattered to him. Whenever it went well for him, he would be quick to share that. He was sort of bragging that his Rasmussen poll approval rating was higher than Obama's was at that point. And sort of a diss on the media at the time. Notice this was from April of 2018, right? The courts are not really, I mean, they're not supposed to be swayed by public opinion polls, but when there's an amicus curiae brief and you have these other people bringing information in, those people can sort of bring the pulse of the people in with it, but that should never really be a deciding factor. So I just put in a little cartoon there for you guys, and I'll conclude this with a cartoon in a second. But know once again why this data is not always reliable, because the public might not have knowledge on the topic, the way things are worded, their biases, right? Notice those as well. All right, so it may not help, but I lied in an exit poll, right? Polls are important. That doesn't mean they're always accurate. Look through the news, see whatever other polls you may have seen recently, and look for examples of how they're worded. Do they align with party? We'll try to find some and see what we can see. All right. Let me know if you guys have any questions.